Let yourself settle in, breathe slowly, and allow your mind to wander back through the mist of centuries. Tonight, we're stepping into a world of stone castles and flickering torchlight, a world where crowns were heavy in more ways than one. You've heard the fairy tales, the towers, the gowns, the handsome princes. But what was it really like to be a princess in medieval times? Close your eyes and imagine cold corridors, the weight of silk and wool, the watchful eyes of advisors and servants, and the soft, constant pressure of duty pressing down like winter fog. There were no fairy godmothers, only political alliances, arranged marriages, and the quiet understanding that you were not born for yourself, but for your family's ambitions. Let's walk together through these shadowed halls, and discover what lay beneath the golden circlets and velvet mantles. From the very moment a princess drew her first breath, her life was already written in invisible ink, a contract signed by kings and queens, sealed with the wax of dynastic hope. If you were born a girl into a royal family in medieval Europe, your arrival was met with mixed feelings. There was relief, perhaps, that your mother had survived the dangerous passage of childbirth. There was joy, because a child was a blessing. But there was also a quiet disappointment that hovered in the birthing chamber like incense smoke. A son meant security, an heir to the throne, a future warrior, a continuation of the bloodline with certainty. A daughter meant possibility. Useful, yes, valuable, certainly, but in a different currency altogether. You were a chess piece, beautifully carved, carefully polished, waiting to be moved across the board. Your childhood was cushioned with privilege, it's true. Soft fabrics against your skin, nurses who sang you lullabies in languages you'd later need to know. You learned to read, perhaps even to write, rare gifts for any medieval child. You studied scripture and psalms, your small voice echoing in the castle chapel. You learned to embroider, those tiny, patient stitches that would occupy so many hours of your future life. But even as you played with carved wooden toys or chased your siblings through garden paths, there were whispers. Messengers arrived on sweating horses, carrying letters sealed with foreign wax. Your father met with advisors behind closed doors, and sometimes, when they emerged, their eyes would fall on you, measuring, considering. You might have been 5 years old, or 7, or 9, when you first heard your name spoken alongside that of a stranger. A prince in a distant land, a duke's son, an alliance that needed cementing. Your mother might have stroked your hair that evening, her fingers gentle but her eyes far away, already mourning the daughter she would someday lose. The education you received was both generous and limited. You learned courtly manners, how to walk with grace, how to bow your head at precisely the right angle, how to make conversation that revealed nothing and pleased everyone. You learned music, your fingers moving over the strings of a lute or the keys of a virginal. The notes floated through stone corridors, beautiful and melancholy. But you did not learn statecraft in the way your brothers did. You did not study military strategy, or ride out to inspect your father's lands. Your world was smaller, interior, a preparation for the interior worlds you would occupy as wife, as mother, as the silent partner in someone else's kingdom. There were exceptions, of course. History remembers them because they were rare. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Isabella of Castile, women who seized power with both hands. But for every Eleanor, there were dozens of princesses whose names we've forgotten, who lived and died in the service of alliances they didn't choose. Even your clothing spoke of your status and your constraint. The gowns were magnificent, layers of silk and samite embroidered with gold thread, trimmed with ermine and vair. But they were also heavy, restrictive, designed more for display than comfort. The headdresses alone could weigh several pounds, pressing against your temples, making your neck ache by evening. You were taught to bear discomfort with grace. That was perhaps the most important lesson, more crucial than Latin or needlework. Grace under pressure. Silence in the face of disappointment. A smile that revealed nothing of the heart beneath. And always, There was the awareness that your value lay not in yourself, but in what you could become for others. A bridge between kingdoms. A womb to carry another family's heirs. A diplomatic solution wrapped in velvet and jewels. The nursery fires burned low in the evening, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Your nurse hummed old songs, songs about brave knights and faithful maidens. And you drifted toward sleep, not yet understanding that you were already promised to a future you couldn't imagine, in a place you'd never seen, to a man whose face you wouldn't know until your wedding day. And in the background, the castle settled into its nighttime rhythms, the changing of the guard, the barking of dogs in the courtyard, the distant sound of a gate closing with a heavy, final thud. By the time you reached your 12th or 13th year, the whispers had become negotiations, and negotiations had become plans. Marriage, in the medieval world, was never about love, at least not at first, and certainly not for princesses. It was diplomacy conducted through the exchange of daughters. Your hand in marriage was a treaty signed in flesh and blood, more binding than any document because it created blood ties that would stretch across generations. The process might begin with a portrait. Artists were dispatched to paint your likeness, and you would sit for hours in your finest gown, holding perfectly still while they captured your features on wood panel or parchment. These images traveled in leather cases, carried by ambassadors across mountains and seas, to be scrutinized by foreign kings and their advisors. Sometimes the negotiations took years. Back and forth went the messengers, discussing dowries and dower rights, inheritance laws and succession clauses. How much land would you bring? How much gold? What rights would you retain if your husband died? What happened to your property if you bore no sons? You were rarely consulted about your preferences. Oh, you might be asked if you were willing, a formality required by church law. But refusal was almost unthinkable. Your father's alliances depended on you. Your family's future security rested on your shoulders. To refuse was to betray not just your father, but your entire lineage. Some princesses were betrothed in infancy, their future husbands named before they could speak. You might grow up knowing that somewhere, in a castle you'd never seen, a boy was growing up who would someday be your husband. You might exchange letters, carefully composed, read by a dozen eyes before they were sealed. You might exchange gifts, a prayer book, a jeweled brooch, a glove embroidered with your initials. But you would remain strangers until your wedding day. The age of marriage varied, but it was often shockingly young by modern standards. 12 or 13 was not uncommon for a princess, though the marriage might not be consummated until a few years later, when you were deemed old enough to safely bear children. Still, 13 years old, and your childhood was over. The dolls and games were put away. You were a wife now, a woman, ready or not. The journey to your new home was its own kind of ordeal. You might travel for weeks or even months, a great procession of carts and horses, servants and guards, carrying your trousseau and your dowry. You left behind everything familiar, your mother's embrace, your siblings' laughter, the particular smell of your home castle, the language you'd spoken since birth. Some princesses never saw their families again. The distances were too great, the roads too dangerous, the politics too unstable. You might receive letters, months old by the time they reached you, telling you of births and deaths, marriages and wars, in a place that had become more memory than reality. And then, the wedding itself. A grand spectacle, perhaps the most important day of your life, and yet a day in which you were more object than subject. You wore white or gold or red, depending on the customs of your new land. You spoke vows in a language you might barely understand. You held the hand of a man you might have met only days before, or perhaps that very morning. His face might be kind, or cold, or merely neutral. He might be near your age or decades older. He might have mistresses already, children by other women, a reputation for cruelty or kindness or simply for indifference. You would learn all of this in time, but on that day, you knew almost nothing. The feast lasted hours, sometimes days. You sat beside your new husband at the high table, smiling, accepting congratulations, enduring the ribald jokes that accompanied every medieval wedding. You barely tasted the food: swan and peacock, venison and boar, subtleties made of sugar and almond paste. And then, the bedding ceremony. Perhaps the most mortifying tradition of all. Your ladies would undress you, while his men undressed him, and then you would be led to the marriage bed while courtiers watched and jested. Priests might bless the bed. Wine might be drunk. And finally, the curtains would close and you would be alone with this stranger who was now your husband. Your duty was clear. Produce heirs, preferably sons. Secure the succession. Be faithful, be obedient, be graceful in all things. And outside the bedchamber, the celebration continued, laughter and music echoing through the halls, while you lay in the darkness beside a stranger, far from home, and tried not to weep. The candles burned down to stubs, their light flickering against the tapestried walls, casting shapes that seemed to shift and change, like the life you'd known dissolving into something new and uncertain. Morning came, as it always does, and with it, your new life began in earnest. As a princess in a foreign court, you occupied a strange position, simultaneously powerful and powerless. You had rank, your title demanded respect, and servants bowed when you passed. But you had little actual authority. You were an outsider, a foreigner, sometimes even viewed with suspicion by the very people you'd been sent to help unite. Your husband might be kind, or he might be distant. Medieval marriage didn't necessarily include companionship or emotional intimacy. He had his duties, you had yours. He spent his days in council meetings, hunting expeditions, military training, diplomatic missions. You spent yours in the women's quarters, that separate world of ladies and maids, needlework and prayer, gossip and careful politicking. The pressure to produce an heir was immediate and relentless. It wasn't simply a personal matter, it was a matter of state security. If you failed to conceive, or if you bore only daughters, or if your children died in infancy, as so many did, your value diminished. Whispers would start. Was the marriage cursed? Was the queen barren? Should the king seek an annulment? Queens had been set aside for less. Catherine of Aragon would learn this lesson centuries later, but the pattern was already well established in medieval times. A princess was valuable for what she could produce, and if she couldn't produce the required heir, her position became precarious. Pregnancy offered no relief from duty. You were expected to appear at state functions, to sit through lengthy ceremonies, to travel when necessary, all while carrying the weight of an unborn child and the weight of a kingdom's expectations. Medical care was primitive, based more on superstition than science. You might wear amulets to protect the baby, say special prayers, avoid certain foods or activities that were believed to cause deformities or miscarriages. And childbirth itself, that was the dark gateway every medieval woman feared. The mortality rate was staggering. 1 in 3 women died in childbirth or from related complications. You might labor for days, attended by midwives and ladies who could do little more than pray and offer comfort. Pain relief was minimal, perhaps a drink of wine mixed with herbs, perhaps nothing at all. If you survived, if the baby survived, there was joy, yes, but also the immediate question, was it a son? A healthy son meant security, for you, for your husband, for the kingdom. A daughter meant you would need to try again, and again, until a son arrived or you died trying. Many princesses spent their entire adult lives in this cycle. Pregnancy, birth, recovery, pregnancy again. Eleanor of Aquitaine bore at least 10 children. Philippa of Hainaut bore 14. Your body was not your own. It was a vessel for dynasty, a tool of statecraft. And if you couldn't produce children, or if your husband decided for political reasons that the marriage needed to end, you had few protections. Annulments could be sought on grounds of consanguinity, since royal families were so intermarried that almost any couple could claim they were too closely related. You might be sent to a convent, your marriage erased as if it had never been, your years of service dismissed with a stroke of papal authority. Even if your marriage was stable and fruitful, your power was always conditional. You could advise your husband, but he didn't have to listen. You could advocate for policies, but you couldn't implement them yourself. You could write letters and build alliances, but always in your husband's name, always in service to his goals. Some queens managed to carve out real influence. They served as regents when their husbands were away at war, or when their sons were too young to rule. They patronized artists and scholars, founded abbeys and hospitals, created networks of power through careful gift-giving and letter-writing. But this required exceptional intelligence, political skill, and luck. For most princesses, life was quieter, more constrained. You presided over your ladies, you managed the household, you performed the ceremonial duties required of royalty. You appeared at feasts and festivals, you received foreign visitors with grace, you smiled and nodded and said the right things. But you were always being watched. Your behavior reflected on your husband and your kingdom. A single misstep, a moment of anger or indiscretion, could become a scandal. You learned to control your face, your voice, your very thoughts. You became a living statue, beautiful, composed, and essentially silent. Your rooms might be luxurious, tapestries on the walls, furs on the bed, a fire in the hearth. But luxury isn't freedom. The gilded cage is still a cage. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, you might have stood at your window, looking out over lands that were supposed to be yours but never quite felt like home, and wondered what your life might have been if you'd been born someone else. Anyone else. The dawn light crept slowly across the stone walls, pale and cool, promising another day of duty, another performance of grace. The court was a dangerous place, more dangerous than any battlefield, in some ways, because the weapons were invisible. As a foreign-born queen or princess, you were perpetually navigating treacherous political waters. There were factions at every court, noble families vying for influence, advisors competing for the king's ear, churchmen pursuing their own agendas. And you were caught in the middle of it all, trying to build alliances while avoiding making enemies. Your own household was your first line of defense, and also your first vulnerability. The ladies who attended you were rarely chosen by you. They were daughters of noble families, sent to court to secure their own family's interests. Every conversation you had with them might be reported back to their fathers or brothers. Every confidence you shared might become ammunition in someone else's political game. You learned to trust no one completely. Even your closest companions might be spies, feeding information to rival factions or foreign powers. Letters you wrote could be intercepted and read. Servants could be bribed to report on your activities, your moods, your private conversations with your husband. And if you came from a rival kingdom, or if relations between your birth country and your adopted one became strained, your position became even more precarious. Suddenly you were suspected of divided loyalties. Were you really loyal to your husband's kingdom, or did your heart still belong to the land of your birth? In times of war, foreign-born queens could become scapegoats, blamed for military defeats or political failures. Isabella of France, wife of Edward II of England, eventually led an invasion of her husband's kingdom and helped depose him. But she was exceptional. Most foreign princesses had neither the resources nor the support to take such dramatic action. Instead, they endured suspicion in silence, proving their loyalty through patience and service. You also had to navigate the complex relationships with your husband's family. His mother might resent you, seeing you as an interloper who had replaced her as the kingdom's primary lady. His sisters might be jealous of your rank. His brothers might have their own ambitions that conflicted with your children's interests. And if your husband had been married before, if there were stepchildren to consider, the dynamics became even more complicated. Blended royal families were rife with conflict. Who would inherit what? Which children would receive the best marriages? How would resources be divided? Your own children were your greatest source of power, and also your greatest vulnerability. You loved them, of course, but they were also political assets. Your sons were potential heirs, your daughters were future diplomatic tools, just as you had been. You saw your own fate replicated in theirs, and there was nothing you could do to prevent it. But children also meant danger. If your husband died while your son was still young, you might become regent, suddenly wielding real power. But that power would be contested. There would be nobles who thought a woman couldn't govern, who wanted to seize control themselves. There might be rival claimants to the throne, your husband's brothers or cousins, eager to push your child aside. Regency could be the most dangerous time of all. You would need to act decisively, to build coalitions, to reward loyalty and punish treachery. But you would need to do all of this while appearing humble and feminine, never grasping, never ambitious for yourself. It was an impossible balance, and many regents failed to maintain it. Even your charitable works, the hospitals you founded, the monasteries you patronized, the poor you fed, even these were political acts. They built your reputation for piety and mercy, but they also required careful management. Give too much, and you'd be accused of wasting the kingdom's resources. Give too little, and you'd be seen as cold-hearted. Every gesture was scrutinized. Every word was weighed. You lived in a constant state of performance, always aware of the eyes upon you, always conscious of the judgments being made. And there was no escape. You couldn't simply walk away from court life. You couldn't retire to the country and live quietly. Your position didn't allow for privacy or retreat. You were royal, and that meant your life belonged to the state, to the dynasty, to the endless machinery of medieval politics. Some women found ways to carve out spaces of autonomy. They became patrons of learning, surrounding themselves with scholars and artists who enriched their lives and gave them intellectual stimulation. They developed deep spiritual practices, finding in religion a realm where they could exercise some measure of control and meaning. But these were small freedoms, islands of self in a sea of obligation. And always, there was the knowledge that your position could vanish in an instant. A husband's death, a son's rebellion, a political shift, and you could find yourself powerless, penniless, perhaps even imprisoned. The wheel of fortune turned constantly, and those at the top had the furthest to fall. The courtyard below your window was full of people, servants and soldiers, merchants and petitioners, all moving through their daily routines, while you watched from above, separate and untouchable, as distant as the stars. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being royal, a loneliness that exists even in crowded rooms, even surrounded by attendants and courtiers. You were never truly alone, and yet you were profoundly isolated. There were always people around you. Ladies who dressed you in the morning, who accompanied you to chapel, who sat with you in the solar while you embroidered or read. Servants who brought your meals, who tended your fire, who slept outside your door at night. Guards who followed you whenever you left your chambers. You couldn't walk through a corridor without encountering a dozen people, all of whom would bow and step aside. But intimacy, real intimacy, was almost impossible. Everyone who approached you wanted something. Access to your husband. A favor for a relative. A letter of recommendation. A gift. Even the most genuine relationships were colored by the vast inequality of power between you and almost everyone else in your world. Your ladies-in-waiting might become companions, but they could never be true friends in the modern sense. The hierarchy was too rigid. They served you. You didn't serve them. And they would leave eventually, called home by their families, married off to advance their own family alliances. You would lose them one by one, and new ladies would arrive to replace them, strangers you would need to learn to trust all over again. Your relationship with your husband might grow into genuine affection over time, or it might remain formal and distant. Medieval marriages were arranged for politics, not compatibility. You might find common ground, shared interests, mutual respect, perhaps even love. But you might also find yourself bound for life to someone whose company you could barely tolerate. And you couldn't complain. To speak openly about unhappiness in your marriage would be scandalous, a betrayal of your duty. So you kept your feelings hidden, presented a united front in public, and dealt with your loneliness in private. Letters were your lifeline to the world beyond your immediate surroundings. You might correspond with your mother or sisters, though months could pass between sending a letter and receiving a reply. You might exchange letters with other queens and princesses, women who understood your position because they lived it themselves. These letters were often formal, full of courtly language and diplomatic pleasantries. But sometimes, between the lines, you could read real feeling, real loneliness reaching across distance to find its echo. Some princesses kept journals, though few survived because women's writings were rarely preserved. In those private pages you might have recorded your true thoughts, your frustrations and fears, your small joys and large sorrows. It would have been dangerous. If such writings fell into the wrong hands, they could be used against you. But perhaps the risk was worth it, to have one place where you could be honest. Religion offered another refuge. The chapel was a place where you could pray in private, where the hierarchy of earth supposedly dissolved before God. You might have found comfort in the rituals, the familiar prayers, the cycle of holy days, the sense of connection to something larger than yourself and your immediate troubles. Many medieval women developed deep spiritual lives. They read religious texts, contemplated theological questions, corresponded with monks and nuns. Some even experienced visions or mystical experiences. Whether these were genuine spiritual encounters or the product of isolation and longing, they provided meaning and purpose. The gardens were another sanctuary. If your castle had a garden, a quiet space with herbs and flowers, perhaps a fountain, you might have spent hours there. The living, growing things asked nothing of you. They didn't want favors or whisper about you behind your back. They simply existed, and their existence was a kind of peace. But even these small refuges were conditional. You couldn't spend too much time alone in the garden. People would wonder what you were doing, would worry that you were meeting someone secretly. You couldn't be too absorbed in your prayers. You might be suspected of fanaticism or of plotting something under the guise of piety. Your children might have been a source of connection, but even that relationship was complicated by your royal status. Nurses and governesses did most of the actual childcare. You saw your children at appointed times. You supervised their education, but you weren't expected to be a mother in the constant, hands-on sense. And when they were old enough, they too would be sent away, your sons to learn the arts of war and governance, your daughters to make their own political marriages. Everyone left eventually. Everyone except the walls of your castle, the cold stone that surrounded you, beautiful and imprisoning all at once. So you learned to live with loneliness. You accepted it as part of your station, as the price of the crown. You carried it with you like your jewels and your title, another heavy thing that no one else could see or share. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, you might have sat by your window, watching the sun set over distant hills, and let yourself feel the full weight of your solitude, before tucking it away again behind your carefully composed face. The evening star appeared in the darkening sky, constant and distant, beautiful and unreachable. Medieval castles were built for defense, and princesses lived with the constant awareness that violence might come at any time. War was a regular feature of medieval life. Kings fought over territory, over succession rights, over insults real and imagined. And when war came, when armies marched and castles were besieged, royal women were not safe simply because of their status. If your castle fell to an enemy, your fate was uncertain. You might be taken hostage, held for ransom, or used as a bargaining chip in peace negotiations. You might be treated with respect, as a valuable prisoner, or you might be treated with casual brutality. The laws of chivalry supposedly protected noblewomen, but those laws were often more honored in the breach than in the observance. History records numerous instances of queens and princesses being imprisoned, sometimes for years or even decades. Eleanor of Aquitaine was imprisoned by her own husband, Henry II, for 16 years after she supported their son's rebellion against him. She was kept in various castles, not in a dungeon, but certainly not free, unable to come and go, unable to exercise her own will. And imprisonment could come for many reasons. If you were suspected of adultery, if you bore a child who didn't resemble your husband, if you were accused of plotting against the king, you could find yourself locked away. The accusations didn't even need to be true. Sometimes the mere suspicion was enough. The penalty for adultery, for a queen, was often death. Your husband's heir needed to be legitimate, beyond question. If you were accused of betraying your marriage bed, you weren't just betraying your husband, you were threatening the entire succession, potentially bastardizing the heir to the throne. The punishment was accordingly severe. And Boleyn would later be executed on charges of adultery, probably falsified, but the precedent was well established long before her time. Queens had been executed or forced into nunneries for centuries on similar charges. The threat was always there, a sword hanging over your head by the thinnest thread. Even within your own household, violence simmered beneath the surface. Disputes between noble families could turn deadly. Feuds could last generations. Someone's father had insulted someone else's father decades ago, and now both families were locked in a cycle of revenge that poisoned court life. You might find yourself caught in these feuds. Perhaps your lady-in-waiting came from a family that was enemies with one of your husband's advisors. Perhaps you inadvertently showed favor to one faction over another. These were dangerous waters, and a single misstep could have deadly consequences. Poison was a constant fear. Every meal could be suspect. Royal households employed food tasters, servants whose job was to eat a portion of every dish before it was served to the king or queen. They were testing for poison, using their own lives as a safeguard for yours. How many tasters died over the centuries, we don't know, but their presence indicates how real the threat was. You might have your own trusted servants who prepared your food, who controlled access to your chambers. But even they could be bribed or threatened. Absolute security was impossible. And there were other forms of violence, less dramatic but equally real. Domestic violence was not uncommon in medieval marriages, even royal ones. A husband who was angry or drunk or simply cruel might strike his wife, and there was little recourse. You couldn't divorce him. You couldn't run home to your family. They were hundreds of miles away, and besides, they would probably tell you to endure it for the sake of the alliance. The Church taught that wives should be obedient to their husbands. Sermons and conduct books emphasized patience, submission, and suffering in silence. A few clerics argued that excessive cruelty was grounds for separation, but excessive was a high bar, and separation didn't mean divorce. You would still be married, just living apart, unable to remarry, unable to escape. So you learned to read moods, to anticipate anger and diffuse it when possible. You learned when to speak and when to remain silent. You learned to make yourself small and agreeable, to avoid provoking violence through careful management of your own behavior. This was survival. This was the reality beneath the glittering surface of court life. And if you were pregnant, you were even more vulnerable. Your body was changing in ways you couldn't control. You were more easily tired, more emotional, more physically limited. And yet the expectations didn't change. You still had to appear at court functions, still had to manage your household, still had to navigate the political complexities of royal life. Miscarriage was common, and could itself be dangerous. Without modern medical care, heavy bleeding could kill you. And if you miscarried repeatedly, the whispers would start again. Was something wrong with you? Was the marriage cursed? Should the king seek a new wife? You carried fear with you like you carried your embroidery basket, a constant companion, rarely mentioned, always present. The night watchman called out the hours, his voice echoing through the darkness, a reminder that guards stood between you and the dangers outside, but also that danger was always near enough to require guarding against. The church was everywhere in medieval life, and for a princess, it was both comfort and constraint. You were raised to be pious. Daily attendance at Mass was expected, often multiple times a day. Matins in the early morning, Vespers in the evening, and various other offices in between. You spent hours on your knees in prayer, in the castle chapel or in your private oratory if you had one. Your days were structured by the church calendar. Feast days and fast days, saints' days and holy days, Advent and Lent and Easter and Pentecost. The liturgical year rolled on with comforting regularity, a rhythm that never changed no matter what political turmoil surrounded you. Fasting was serious business. During Lent, you would abstain from meat for 40 days. On Fridays throughout the year, you ate fish instead of meat. Before receiving communion, you fasted from midnight. These were not suggestions, they were religious obligations, and failure to observe them was sin. For many medieval women, religious devotion was genuine and deep. The promise of heaven was real, the threat of hell was real, and the state of your soul was more important than the state of your body or your worldly position. You might spend hours contemplating religious texts, meditating on the lives of saints, examining your conscience for sins. The confessional was a place of both relief and danger. You were expected to confess your sins regularly, to tell a priest everything you'd done wrong. But what you said in confession could theoretically reach the king's ears if the priest was more loyal to his sovereign than to the seal of the confessional. So even there, even in the most private religious moment, you had to be careful. Pilgrimages offered one of the few opportunities for travel and adventure. A pious queen might request permission to visit a famous shrine, to pray at the tomb of a saint, to seek healing or forgiveness, or simply to fulfill a vow. The journey might take months. You would travel with a large retinue, staying in monasteries and noble houses along the way, seeing new landscapes and meeting new people. These pilgrimages were acts of devotion, but they were also breaks from the monotony of court life. For a few months you were on the road, moving forward, pursuing a goal that was yours rather than someone else's. The discomforts of medieval travel, the bad food, the hard beds, the long days on horseback, might have been almost welcome compared to the gilded prison of the castle. But religion was also used to control you. Conduct books written by churchmen told you how to behave, how to be a good wife, a good mother, a good Christian woman. You were supposed to be modest, chaste, obedient, silent. You were the daughter of Eve, born with the stain of original sin, naturally prone to weakness and temptation. You needed constant guidance from men, from your husband, from your confessor, from the church hierarchy. If you stepped out of line, if you were too outspoken or too independent, you could be accused of pride, the worst of sins. Pride led to all other sins, the church taught. And prideful women were dangerous. They upset the natural order that God had ordained. Some women found ways to use religion to carve out spaces of power. Establishing monasteries and convents, becoming patrons of religious houses, gave you influence over appointments and resources. Abbesses wielded significant power in their communities, and if you had founded or funded a convent, the abbess owed you loyalty. Religious houses also provided refuge for women who needed it. If your husband died and you didn't want to remarry, if your children were grown and you wanted peace, you might retire to a convent. Not as a nun necessarily, but as a wealthy patron who lived in the convent's guest quarters, supporting the community financially while enjoying its protection and its quiet rhythm of prayer. Some royal women did become nuns themselves, taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. This was one way to escape the marriage market permanently. Once you'd taken religious vows, No one could force you to marry. You belonged to God alone. But even in religious houses, hierarchy persisted. Nobly born nuns typically received better treatment than common ones. And if you entered a convent as a royal patron rather than a full nun, you might live quite comfortably, with your own servants, your own apartments, freedom to come and go within limits. The cult of the Virgin Mary provided a model of ideal womanhood, but an impossible one. Mary was virgin and mother both, pure and fruitful, obedient and exalted. You were supposed to emulate her, but how could any mortal woman achieve such contradictory perfection? So you did your best. You prayed. You fasted. You gave alms. You founded chapels and commissioned religious art. You tried to be good, according to the Church's definition of goodness, and hoped it would be enough. And in your private prayers, in the silence of your heart, perhaps you spoke to God more honestly, telling Him what you couldn't tell anyone else, hoping He at least would understand. The monastery bells rang out across the valley, their sound carrying for miles, marking the hours of prayer, constant as heartbeat, comforting as breath. If you survived childbirth, if you survived illness and plague and the countless dangers of medieval life, you might live to see middle age and beyond, but aging brought its own challenges and fears. As you grew older, your value in the marriage market diminished. Once you passed childbearing age, once you could no longer produce heirs, your political usefulness declined sharply. You were still royal, still entitled to respect, but you were no longer essential to anyone's plans. This could actually bring a kind of freedom. The pressure to be constantly pleasing, constantly fertile, constantly useful, might finally ease. You could turn your attention to other pursuits: patronage of the arts, religious devotion, management of your dower lands. Your dower was crucial to your security in widowhood. These were lands or revenues assigned to you when you married, guaranteed to support you if your husband died before you. A good dower settlement was essential. It meant the difference between comfort and destitution in your old age. But dower rights were often contested. Your husband's heir, possibly your own son, might resent having to part with lands or revenues to support you. He needed resources to run his own kingdom. Why should you continue to control valuable properties? So you might find yourself negotiating with your own child, trying to secure what was legally yours, dealing with advisors who saw you as an obstacle to their ambitions. The power dynamics you'd navigated as a young wife shifted again, and not always in your favor. Some queen's dowager wielded enormous influence. If you were the mother of the reigning king, if you'd been a wise counselor to your husband, your son might continue to seek your advice and support. You might serve as regent during his minority, or during his absences. You might arrange marriages for your younger children and grandchildren, continuing the diplomatic work that had defined your own youth. But other widowed queens were sidelined, sent to live on their dower lands far from court, effectively retired from political life. You might spend your last years managing rural estates, far from the center of power, watching from a distance as events unfolded without your input. The loss of your husband, even if the marriage had been unhappy, was a profound disruption. He had been the sun around which your life orbited. Your status came through him. Your place at court existed because of him. Even if you'd chafed against his authority, even if you'd longed for independence, his death left you unmarred. Medieval society was suspicious of independent women, especially powerful ones. A widowed queen with wealth and influence but no male guardian was an anomaly, something that needed to be managed. There might be pressure for you to remarry, to be safely contained within another marriage where a husband could control your resources and your influence. Some widows did remarry, sometimes for love, if they were lucky enough to choose their own partners at last. But marrying again meant giving up control of your dower lands to your new husband. It meant potentially producing heirs who would complicate succession questions. It was risky. Many chose not to remarry. You might take a vow of chastity, a semi-religious commitment that protected you from unwanted marriage proposals without requiring you to actually become a nun. You could live independently, manage your own lands, make your own decisions for the first time in your life. But independence came with loneliness. Your children were grown and scattered, pursuing their own lives and dynasties. Your ladies-in-waiting were younger women now, a new generation that didn't remember your glory days. Your contemporaries, the people who'd shared your youth and understood your experiences, were dying off one by one. You became a living link to the past. Younger courtiers might seek you out for stories, for advice based on your decades of experience. Or they might ignore you, seeing only an old woman whose time had passed. Physical aging was its own challenge. Medieval medicine had few treatments for the ailments of old age. Arthritis might make needlework painful, the craft that had occupied so many hours of your life. Your eyesight might fail, making reading difficult. Your hearing might dim, isolating you further. And always, there was the question of your own death. You might plan for it carefully, commissioning a tomb, making arrangements for masses to be said for your soul, distributing your possessions among your children and favored servants. Where would you be buried? Near your husband? Near your children who died young? In the monastery you'd founded? These decisions mattered. They determined where you would rest for eternity, where people would come to pray for you, how you would be remembered. Some medieval queens left detailed wills, fascinating documents that revealed their priorities and affections. They remembered faithful servants. They left money for the poor. They endowed chapels and schools. Through these bequests, they tried to shape their legacy, to be remembered not just as someone's wife or mother, but as a person who'd made a difference. And finally, when the end came, you faced it with whatever faith and courage you'd accumulated over your long, complex life. You received the last rites. You made your peace with God and with any people you'd wronged. And then, you let go of the weight you'd carried for so long, the crown, the title, the endless obligations. The cathedral bells tolled, deep and solemn, announcing a royal death, while torches flickered in the gathering dusk, casting long shadows across the courtyard where you'd walked so many times, now walking no more. After death came memory, and memory was its own kind of battleground. How would you be remembered? Who would tell your story? These questions mattered to medieval people perhaps even more than they matter to us, because they believed that prayers said for your soul could actually affect your fate in the afterlife. Being remembered meant being prayed for, and being prayed for meant hope for heaven. Chronicles were usually written by men, monks and clerics who had their own biases and agendas. They might praise you as a paragon of feminine virtue, pious, obedient, fertile, gracious. Or they might condemn you as ambitious, scheming, too proud, too independent. Either way, the real woman you were, the complexity of your inner life, was often lost. Some princesses left more tangible legacies. The monasteries you founded continued for centuries, housing religious communities, providing education, caring for the sick. The hospitals and almshouses you established served the poor long after your death. These institutions carried your name, and kept your memory alive among people who might never have known you personally but benefited from your charity. Artistic patronage was another form of legacy. The illuminated manuscripts you commissioned, the tapestries you designed or funded, the buildings you helped construct, these beautiful objects survived you. They still exist in some cases, centuries later, testaments to your taste and your resources and your desire to create something lasting. Your children were your most obvious legacy, your genetic and cultural descendants who carried forward your bloodline. But their fates were beyond your control. They might thrive or fail, might remember you with love or indifference, might honor your memory or ignore it in pursuit of their own ambitions. Letters and documents you'd signed or written might be preserved in archives. Charters granting land or privileges, diplomatic correspondence, personal notes. Historians would pore over these documents centuries later, trying to reconstruct your life and character from fragmentary evidence. But so much was lost. Women's writings were rarely preserved as carefully as men's. Your everyday thoughts, your private feelings, your opinions on the events you witnessed, most of this vanished with you. We know the outlines of medieval royal women's lives, but the interior landscape remains mysterious. Some queens became legends. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Matilda of Tuscany, Isabella of Castile. Their names are still known today because their actions were so dramatic, so impactful, that history couldn't ignore them. But for every legendary queen, there were dozens whose names appear only briefly in chronicles, mentioned mainly in relation to the men they married or the children they bore. Is that fair? No. But fairness wasn't a medieval concept, at least not in the way we understand it. Life was hierarchical, unequal, often brutal. Women were valued differently than men. That was simply how things were. And yet, within those constraints, individual women found ways to exercise agency, to make choices, to influence events. Not always successfully. Not always in ways that were recorded. But they were there, thinking, feeling, acting, navigating the same complex political and emotional landscapes we navigate today, just in very different circumstances. Your tomb might be elaborate, carved marble, your effigy lying in state with hands folded in prayer, your crown on your head, your symbols of status surrounding you. Or it might be simple, a stone slab with your name and dates. Either way, it marked the place where your body rested, where people could come to remember you. Over the centuries, your tomb might be damaged or destroyed. Wars, reforms, revolutions, each brought new waves of iconoclasm. Religious reformers might see your elaborate tomb as idolatrous and smash it. Revolutionary mobs might see it as a symbol of aristocratic oppression and desecrate it. Or it might simply crumble through neglect, the stone wearing away, your name becoming illegible. But sometimes, your memory survived in unexpected ways. A folk tale might grow up around you, embroidering facts with fantasy. A local tradition might remember you as a good queen who was kind to the poor. Or a curse might be attributed to you, some dramatic story of betrayal and revenge that had little to do with historical reality, but kept your name alive in popular imagination. Modern historians try to recover these lost lives. They piece together evidence from documents and archaeological finds. They try to understand what life was really like for medieval royal women, to see past the stereotypes and legends to the human beings underneath. And what they find is complicated. Lives of privilege and constraint, power and powerlessness, duty and desire. Women who were both agents and victims, who made real choices within very limited options, who were as fully human as anyone living today, with the same capacity for courage, intelligence, creativity, and resilience. Your life mattered. Even if history mostly forgot you. Even if your name appears only in dusty genealogies. You lived. You loved and suffered. You made the best choices you could with the options you had. And that, all of that, deserves to be remembered. The wind whispered through the old stones, carrying echoes of lives long past, voices that spoke once and now are silent, but not entirely forgotten. Let us pause here, at the end of our journey through these shadowed halls, and consider what it meant to be a princess in medieval times. The fairy tales lied, or at least, they told only the smallest sliver of truth. Yes, there were castles and crowns, gowns of silk and jewels that caught the light. Yes, there was privilege beyond measure, compared to the peasants who toiled in the fields or the merchants who struggled to make their fortunes. But privilege is not the same as happiness. Security is not the same as freedom. And wearing a crown did not make you immune to sorrow, loneliness, or fear. From birth, a medieval princess was a piece in a game she didn't choose to play. Her value was calculated in political alliances and potential heirs. Her body was not her own. It belonged to her family's ambitions first, then to her husband's dynasty. Her life was a performance, every gesture watched, every word weighed, every choice evaluated for its political implications. She might be married to a stranger before she turned 14. She might be sent to a foreign country where she didn't speak the language. She might spend her adult life in a cycle of pregnancy and childbirth, each time risking death, until she produced the sons required of her or until her body gave out. She lived with danger on all sides. The danger of childbirth. The danger of political intrigue. The danger of false accusations. The danger of war. The danger of her husband's displeasure or her son's ambition. She learned to walk carefully, to speak carefully, to trust no one completely. And yet, within these crushing constraints, individual women found ways to live meaningful lives. They patronized art and learning. They practiced charity. They advised kings and influenced policy. They founded institutions that outlasted them. They loved their children, even as they prepared to lose them to duty. They found friendship where they could. They prayed, hoping for something better beyond this world. The strength required to live such a life, the resilience, the patience, the courage, these things should not be underestimated. It takes tremendous fortitude to maintain grace under such relentless pressure. To perform dignity when you feel anything but dignified. To keep going when every road leads to some form of suffering or loss. Medieval princesses were not passive victims. They were active participants in their own lives, making choices, forming strategies, pursuing what small happinesses they could find. They were limited by their time and culture in ways we can barely imagine, but they were not helpless. And their experiences, though specific to their time, speak to something more universal. The tension between duty and desire. The loneliness of being set apart from others. The challenge of maintaining your sense of self when others see you only as a role or a symbol. The grief of losing control over your own life. These are human experiences, not confined to any one era. We look back at them from our vantage point centuries later, and we see both their limitations and their humanity. We can mourn the choices they weren't allowed to make, while also admiring the strength with which they bore the choices imposed upon them. Their stories remind us that progress is real, that the freedoms we enjoy today, the ability to choose our own partners, to pursue our own goals, to define our own identities, these were fought for and hard won. They remind us not to take our freedom for granted. But their stories also remind us that the fundamental human experiences haven't changed. Love and loss. Hope and disappointment. The search for meaning. The desire for connection. The fear of death. The need to matter, to be remembered, to have your life mean something. Medieval princesses felt all of these things just as we do. They were not alien creatures. They were women, complex, intelligent, feeling women, who happened to be born into circumstances that gave them no real choice about the shape their lives would take. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you can hold in your mind an image of these women. Picture them standing in their stone castles, looking out windows at landscapes that were both theirs and not theirs. Feeling the weight of their crowns, physical and metaphorical. Wondering about the lives they might have lived if they'd been born in different times, or as different people. They are gone now, most of them forgotten except by specialists who study old documents. But once they were as alive as you are now. Once they lay awake at night, thinking, feeling, hoping. Once they mattered, not because they were princesses, but because they were human. And that common humanity across the centuries, might be the most important thing to remember as you close your eyes and let the modern world fade away. Sleep well, and let their distant lives remind you of the preciousness of your own freedom, and the shared experiences that connect us all across time. The last candle flickered and went dark, leaving only starlight, and silence, and the slow, gentle rhythm of breath. And so, we've reached the end of our journey through these stone corridors and shadowed lives. Thank you for walking with me tonight, for learning about the women who lived behind the fairy tales, who bore the weight of crowns we can barely imagine. May their stories, quiet and constrained as they were, bring you peace as you rest. May the distance of centuries soften the sadness of their struggles. And may you drift into sleep with gratitude for your own choices, your own freedom, your own precious life. Rest well, and dream gently.